So, as you may or may not know, I initially gave Elden Ring a very negative review. I criticized the game's technical performance, the difficulty, the scarcity of upgrade items, problems with the open world, among a number of other things. And my opinion on a lot of those has changed, and on a lot of them, it hasn't changed. So I think something that I really underplayed the first time I did my review, and it's something that I was probably not as conscious of as I should have been, is the game's technical issues. Now, on March 3rd, they released a patch that fixed an issue. If you look at the wiki, says issue with graphics cards not working, or not recognizing graphics cards, or something like that. And I was thinking back, and I'm like, I've been playing this game for a couple weeks now, and it did feel like in the first week of March, everything just got much, much easier. And then I was really thinking about it, because when this came out, the technical issues were pretty bad. And I mean, that's not just me. This game, despite being hyped, had mixed reviews on Steam. It had a lot of negative reviews. A lot of people were complaining about the delay in using the controller, commands being dropped, jankiness, bad frame rate, screen tearing, all that kind of stuff. And since they released the update and NVIDIA updated their drivers and stuff, I find the performance is actually fairly good. It's still a bit janky and the frame rate still stutters, but much, much better. And I feel like that was part of my reason why I was doing poor in combat. And it's not just an issue with this game. I remember when Dark Souls 2 came out, I got really frustrated how bad the performance in that game was. And then once they patched it, it became a lot more playable. The ultimate example of this is probably Dark Souls 1, which is kind of a technical mess even to this day. But the first PC release of it, with Prepare to Die Edition, was so poorly optimized you needed to download a mod to even play it, called DS Fix. Otherwise, the frame rate was like at 10 frames per second, all this other stuff. I remember playing it and I'm like, geez, this is the most difficult game I've ever played. What's with how slow your character is? And it wasn't even due to like enemy damage or anything. It was just the frame rate and screen tearing and stuff like that. So that being fixed is really good. The other thing I think the problem I had upon initial release was none of the guides were up. If you went to the wiki, it didn't tell you where things were. We now have the big map that shows where everything is. There's much less of an issue of finding things. There's a much better guide as to what the recommended area progression is. And I think part of my problem, so those are issues that are either FromSoft's fault or just things the community hadn't caught up with yet. For my part, I think my big issue is I was trying to play this like a Souls game, and there's aspects of it that are like a Souls game, but there's aspects of it that are extremely different from a Souls game. And it took me a while to figure it out. And once again, part of what helped me to figure that out was once guides came out and people started explaining what it was. So one of the big things in the normal Souls games is DS2 was probably the easiest to do this in, but there is at least an attempt to prevent sequence breaking in some sort of at least partially linear progression from area to area. Even if there was kind of alternative ways you could go through the areas, generally speaking, they scaled up at difficulty at fairly even intervals. So there wasn't always just a massive jump in difficulty from one area to another. You could, generally speaking, be fairly confident that if you did okay in the previous level, it's going to be a bit harder, but there's new weapons, there's more souls, you can upgrade, that kind of thing. Now, because this is open world, it's very easy to sequence break. And people who are really good at this game, it's probably not as much of an issue. And in fact, because of the way the game's set up, it encourages sequence breaking, because there's some items like the ball bearings that you almost need to play the base game. And a lot of them tend to be in very far out places. Like, some of the ball bearings are like, one of them was up here in the sealed tunnel, and you start here. Also, like, one of them I think was there, or there, and then one of them was up here. So really far away, but they're kind of critical items in this game, especially because of how scarce upgrade materials can be. And so, like, if you're looking at area progression, it starts down here, goes up to there, and then up to the lakes, and then up to Altus Plateau. But the first time I was playing the game, I thought it went to Caelid, which is an end game area or a later game area. So I was just getting completely destroyed there by basically everything. And it kind of encourages that because there is a teleporter somewhere around here that sends you there. And so I thought that was kind of an appropriate area to go. But then, so I just started the game over again with a new character, and I tried to adhere a lot more to the sequence of difficulty. And I got the map up and I started making sure I was going through all the mini dungeons. The mini dungeons are kind of hard to find. You just kind of have to ride along cliffs, the base of cliffs, and hope that you can see them. And it's not always easy to see them, it can be pretty difficult to tell where they even are. And I think a lot of them are just not something, unless you want to put in like dozens of hours in just pure searching for things that can be kind of difficult to find. It makes the game a lot harder. If you use a map, it's just down to whether or not you can beat the bosses and beat the mini dungeons, which I find a lot easier, especially given if you kind of know what order to do stuff in, you'll have become the appropriate power level by the time you get to the next area to be able to do it properly. Also, just there's a lot of kind of critical stuff you almost need to play the game, like the Dew Talisman that grants you HP regen. I find is kind of a critical item because I tend to play tank builds that don't really use very much magic, so it lets you top up between fights, so you don't really have to use your Estus flasks nearly as much. But there's all kinds of goodies. Also, just a lot of things are not very straightforward. Once again, the advantage of the original Souls games was because they were somewhat linear, it was harder to miss things, or it was easier to go back and find stuff. But you didn't often miss core gameplay mechanics. But in this game, I'm not even sure what really activates the round table hold. In some playthroughs, I've gotten it like 20 minutes into the game. In some playthroughs, it's shown up 2 to 3 hours in the game. And since it's the central hub, that can be kind of difficult. Also, figuring out how to get the Spirit Ashes upgrader. So if you're like me and you don't want to play online, but you want to use a summon NPC, to upgrade them, you have to go through. It's not really that complex once you figure it out. You just have to talk to a couple different people at the location, at the round hold table or whatever. But once again, unless you're really good at kind of figuring these things out and you have the patience for it, you're just not going to find it. So, like, when I was replaying the game with a guide, it's like, okay, so I have to do this to unlock the NPC upgrader. I should start in this area. Okay, the charm that gives you equip load upgrade is this way. Even stuff like the things that allow you to equip more talismans, you find out the certain bosses you have to kill to get those. And there's one of them where after you kill two main bosses, you have to go back to the round table hold and then talk to someone and they'll give you it. But if you kill a third story boss, then they disappear and you can't get it. There's just a lot of stuff like that in this game. Fortunately, some quests, they give you a letter or something, and the letter gives you a location. But it would be really nice if we had a quest tracker, like a journal or something that every other game like this has, where it's like, go here, you fucking idiot. Because I can't always remember them all, and it gets confusing, and the quests don't break quite as easy as they did in the previous games, but I still think it's one of the weaker aspects of it. So those are kind of some basic issues I had with it. It's not necessarily the game's fault. It's more kind of my expectations of it, and it being kind of different. Equipment in this game I also find is just a lot better. Something I was not expecting, because from like DS2 on, armor has just sucked. But armor in this game is actually really good, and playing a tank build is a lot more viable than I remember it being. So it seems like they massively buffed armor and massively buffed shields. So it's actually worthwhile now to try to optimize your defenses for the specific type of boss you're going up against. Because I know I would do that in DS2 and DS3, and it would be like, oh, it reduces the damage you take from lightning by like 5%. or something. And in this one, if you optimize, it can reduce it by like 30%. So you can take a lot more hits. And heavy armor means you can shrug off a lot of attacks like arrows and stuff from regular enemies. Also, status effects are much better in this. So, like, I using the Graveborn Scythe because it has inherent bleed damage. But if you use an Ash of War on it, it also does frost damage, and they both build up pretty quick. So because both, I think, do damage based on enemies' HP percentage, not based on their... it's not based on your attack rating as much. You can just kind of melt through a lot of bosses that have massive amounts of HP. There's also a rapier you get later in the game that does Scarlet Rot damage. You can also put poison on it. And when I was fighting Margit, I think his name is, I just melted through him as if he wasn't even there by just using status effects. So that's a lot better. I'm not really used to that. I'm used to more using really high alpha damage to just kill enemies in a couple shots. So kind of figuring out that you're kind of more supposed to play it that way, that armor works better, that shields work better, that this game is more flexible to your play style, took me a while to kind of get down. So I think it is different enough from the previous ones. It might even be in some ways an advantage to come into this not having played the previous ones as much, just because your expectations will be a lot more different. And you'd probably play it a bit more like a typical open world game. I do think the boss difficulty can be pretty schizophrenic, though. Some of the crypt bosses will die in like 4 hits. And then you get into like the Erd Tree bosses that you just wail on and wail on. And some enemies are resistant to status effects. Part of the issue is it's a bit like DS2 in terms of the bosses, where they definitely went for quantity over quality. So some of the boss fights will be gimmick, some will be gank, some of them will be status effect based ones, some of them will be HP sponge based ones. There's a lot of variety, but most of them just don't feel very well thought out. I think the reason why I thought all the bosses were HP sponges was because I kept trying to fight dragons, and dragons just have a ton of HP. A lot of the field bosses I find tend to be harder than the dungeon bosses. Like, the Knight Cavalry aren't particularly hard, but they have a lot of health, and it can take a long time to kind of whittle them down. You also had the Great Tree Knight, or whatever his name was, who was placed at the beginning of the game as kind of a troll. Now, something I will 100% stand behind as an initial criticism is the fall damage. The fall damage is bullshit. I don't think it's consistent. I could be wrong, but I feel like sometimes in dungeons or special areas where you have to jump down, you can jump much further without dying than you can in other places. And it's very unclear. And sometimes you just have to take a leap of faith. And sometimes there are things that look like platforms and they aren't platforms. And sometimes if you land on a platform to break your fall and then you jump down, it's treated as if you fell from the full height even though you had stopped. And I just don't think it's very fun. And numerous people have told me that you can throw rainbow stones or whatever to determine whether or not a fall will kill you. But I just don't think that's fun. I think that's very, like, obnoxious to have to stop and do that every time. And I think it should just be like how, from my understanding, it was in Sekiro or Jedi Fallen Order, where if you jump from a height that'll kill you, it just puts you back on top of the cliff. I think that would encourage exploration a lot more, and I think it would lead to less frustration. But overall, I'm going to revise my opinion of this game. I'm going to give it probably a 9 out of 10 now. Some of this was just my issue of me sucking, of me not really understanding how to play it. Some of it is just that the community had to kind of catch up with a lot of the you know what I'm trying to say, the guides and stuff. And some of it was just really bad base technical problems. But overall, I think it's pretty good. It's definitely not for everyone, but I do like Elden Ring. I'm going to give it, like I said, a 9 out of 10. I think it's gotten better. I think they fixed a lot of the technical issues with it. And I'm kind of excited to keep playing it and see what else I can discover.